Hey everyone, I'm Brian Parks, and in this video I want to talk some more about PHP. Specifically, we'll talk about how to use PHP to connect to MySQL database, or in our case it'll actually be MariaDB, more on that in a minute, but with a slight twist. We'll actually be running PHP in Windows Subsystem for Linux. So I'm running on a Windows machine, but rather than install PHP on my Windows machine, it's a lot easier for me to just install the packages in Ubuntu running in Windows Subsystem for Linux. I did a quick introduction to how to actually configure that in a video earlier on my channel, a few months ago actually, so I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Basically this follows on from that. I haven't done anything to the setup, it's exactly the same. That's not true. I did add one thing, and I'll mention that in a minute. But let's get into it. Okay, so first I'm going to start up my Windows terminal, and let's make that bigger, and open up my Windows Subsystem for Linux shell. This is actually Windows Subsystem for Linux 1. This is the exact same setup that I was using before. I do have a Windows Subsystem for Linux 2 shell running actually a newer version of Ubuntu, but we'll stick with what I've been using in the past. So I actually already created a directory for this. I called it ytdemo, and let's open Visual Studio Code just like that. And notice that Visual Studio Code is running locally in Windows, and then it's opening the remote connection to the files in Windows Subsystem for Linux. So basically we're running locally but editing remotely. So, or reverse that depending on how you think about it. With Visual Studio Code is local, but all the files, and we're going to run PHP and all that in the Windows Subsystem for Linux environment. So now we've got two pieces. We've got PHP, we've got our code. Now for the third piece. I'm actually not running MySQL. There are a bunch of different reasons for that, but there is a completely open source kind of clone of MySQL called MariaDB, and that's actually what I'm running. For me, it worked a little bit better, and one of the really cool things is that it comes with a tool called MySQL, which is the best MySQL client that I found, graphical MySQL client that I found. My cat is playing with a duck in the background. Okay, so I'm just going to connect to my local, again, MariaDB instance. We have this database called ytdemo, and it has one table called people with an ID column, and then a name and a title column. The data, it just has two records, Brian and Bob, and that's what we'll use for this demo. So let's jump back to the code here, and obviously we've got a select query. Great. Next, we'll connect to MySQL, and the way to do it, kind of the modern way to do it, if you're not using an ORM, an object relational mapper, which there are several good ones for PHP out there. I'll do a video at some point in the future of at least one ORM, maybe a couple different examples. That's kind of the new modern way to interface with databases. It allows you to think more from a programming standpoint and more from an object-oriented design standpoint, whereas this is very much like, let's connect to the database, let's write SQL queries, that sort of thing. It's a little bit lower level. So we create a new MySQL I object, and to do that we pass the server name, and notice that I actually have a port. It's not just localhost, it's localhost colon 3306. The reason for that is if I just specify localhost, the PHP runtime is going to try to connect to MySQL via a named pipe. Basically in Linux world, it's just a file on disk that is a pipe between two processes. Since MySQL, or in my case MariaDB, and PHP are not actually running in the same, they are running on the same physical machine, but they're not running in the same execution environment. One is running in WSL and one is running actually on Windows. That named pipe is not going to work. So we do need to specify that it should use the TCP connection and actually try to make a network connection, even though it looks like it's going back to itself. So by specifying this port, it says make this TCP connection to this address and this port. And 3306 is the default MySQL and MariaDB port. Next, we need to specify a user and a password. And this is, I actually have a username and password that I use kind of for all development on my local machine. It is hidden up in this secrets region up here, kind of hidden away. The next thing we need to do is actually say that we're going to use a particular database. And this is equivalent to the use command in MySQL. So I say select db ytdemo to use that database. I could actually have specified it in this constructor here as a fourth parameter, but I chose to split it out just to show how you might do it. So this is the constructor for this object, and then there's a method called select_db that tells the runtime what database to use, and then we can run a query, and we'll just pass in that query that we were using, that we wrote before, and that returns a result on success. On failure, it actually returns null, which can be kind of weird, null or false. It returns a mixed type. So most of the time, it'll return a result set, like result. But if you're just if you're running, say, a create table, obviously there's no result set that's going to come back from that. So it might return true instead of an actual object. But in this case, since we are selecting something, it will return an actual object, and we'll call fetch row. That's the easiest thing. There are a couple other methods that you can use to access data here, but basically this returns either an associative array or an array if there is a row to retrieve. If there are no more rows to retrieve, it returns false. So that's why we can use it kind of in this nested statement. So while we have a row, while we can get a row, we'll just dump it to the screen using printr. So let's go ahead and start the development server, php-s, localhost, we'll say 8000 for the port. And then let's switch over to a browser. And there we go. It's obviously the same thing because I haven't changed this code from when I first wrote it. But we get the first row with the ID of 1, and then Brian and person, 2, Bob and manager. Now, let's say we wanted to actually get a little bit more structure to it. So let's go off to the PHP documentation, go off to php.net, and we'll search for MySQL I. A little too clicky with the mouse. Okay, so MySQL I, the MySQL improved extension, and let's just click on this class. So if we go down to the query method and get its documentation, we'll see return values false on failure. For successful other queries, you'll either get a MySQL I result object or true. So let's see what MySQL I result looks like. Okay, so we have fetch all, fetch array, fetch assoc, and then fetch row is what we just did. Let's try fetch assoc and see what that does. all of these work essentially the same way. They either get something, or if there's nothing more to get, they get nothing. So let's go back to this page and click refresh. And now we have a little bit more structure to it, right? We get ID, name, title as our keys, and then ID is 1, name is Brian, title is person. So let's make this a little more HTML friendly. Instead of just dumping it to the array, dumping it to the screen, let's show how you might use this in an actual HTML context. So let's do okay, so there are differences of opinion on how you might do this. Either you might interpolate HTML directly in the PHP, so you might do something like that, and then a UL, and then do that sort of thing. Or if that looks kind of messy to you, obviously you can just do echo and that. I used to do the first way I showed, but for this example, I don't know, that doing it this way seems a little bit more user-friendly. And just because I want some formatting in my resulting HTML, let's add a \n, and then here we'll do echo 4 spaces, li, and then we'll get the name. Let's get the name. Right, that looks reasonable. And then echo, we'll close the UL and give it another \n. Oh, we need, there we go. Okay, that, it lints fine, so syntax is good. Let's see if it does the right thing over in our browser. It does. Okay, so there we have it. We've accessed the database. We have pulled some results back, and we've shown them on the screen in HTML. So let's talk a little bit about how you might do some other things with MySQL. So the first thing is, this is a select query, right? So this is great for retrieval, but what about the some other things, right? So if you've heard the acronym CRUD, we're talking create, read, update, delete, right? So we've done the read part, but what about create, update, and delete? Well, you can do basically the same thing, but for most of those, you just won't get a result back. You'll get either a true or something that's falsy. So obviously, for update, you do update people set name equals whatever where ID equals 1, that sort of thing. So you get your basic SQL command, you put it together, and then you just inject it in there. Now, most of the time, you're not going to be running queries that you can easily hard code into your PHP script. You're going to be pulling some information from users, and the recommendation, extreme recommendation, very strong recommendation, is that you don't just take user input and dump it straight into a SQL database without first doing some sanitization. And especially you don't just stick it into the SQL command, because then you get things like the XKCD Bobby drop tables, which if you're not familiar with that comic, I'll leave it linked in the description below. It's great. This is a security vulnerability called SQL injection, and basically what it is the ability for attackers to put something into, say, a text box, click submit on your form, and have it run their SQL command instead of what you intended. The way to get around that is to do parameterized queries. And rather than try to live code that, I'm actually going to go back to the documentation and show what you would actually use for that. So there's actually a function here called escape string. And it's actually called real escape string because the escape string wasn't real enough. And there is an example here. So using the object-oriented style, which is what I've been showing you, there is a procedural style, which is basically the name of the functions with MySQL I underscore in front of them. That's not recommended. The object-oriented version is definitely what's recommended. So here we're connecting to a database. We create a temporary table, and then we insert into that table something like that. That's bad, and you can see they actually use a value for city that will intentionally break the query, right? So that's bad. That'll break. But what we can do is MySQL real escape string city, and then plug that in. So that's still better. We're doing some sanitization, but this isn't quite the prepared or the parameterized query. So let's find out how to do that, right? So let's go back to query. And this page might have an example. It doesn't look like it does. So let's actually see if I can find it real quick. So prepare. Yeah, here we go. So we have a connection to a SQL database. Then we do MySQL I prepare. And notice that instead of setting a value for name, we actually give it a question mark. This indicates that there's a parameter there that we want to treat exclusively as data. We don't want to treat it as part of the SQL command. We want to treat it as data that should be used by the SQL command. So this gives us a statement object. Then we can bind the parameter with the value of city, right? And then we can execute the statement. So let's see if we can find what that statement actually does. So we get a MySQL I statement, and then there's the bind param. So for this call, there's obviously it starts with the statement object, and then you provide the types and the values to be bound to those parameters. Right? So pretty straightforward, but with this scenario, the MySQL infrastructure and the PHP runtime won't treat your data as part of the SQL statement. It will only ever treat it as data. So even if someone puts in absolute garbage or something that's designed to attack your database, that's designed to be run as SQL, no part of the system will ever treat it as SQL that should be run, effectively blocking that SQL injection vulnerability. If you're curious about SQL injection vulnerabilities and that sort of thing, I can certainly go into a lot more detail on web application security and specifically SQL injection. So leave a comment below if that's something you'd want to see in an upcoming video. All right, so that's basically how to connect to MySQL, or again in my case MariaDB, using PHP and using Windows Subsystem for Linux. Again, just as a review, the only thing we did in Windows Subsystem for Linux was actually run the PHP. The MySQL database, or again in my case MariaDB, was running on Windows. We were running the web browser on Windows. We were running Visual Studio Code on Windows. but it was accessing files and the PHP runtime running in Windows Subsystem for Linux. So I think that's a great way to do development. It really kind of declutters the kind of execution side of things, because let's say I'm doing PHP development for a while, and then either I need to upgrade PHP, or I'm done doing PHP development and I just want to blow away that environment. I can just get rid of that Windows Subsystem for Linux environment. I don't have to do any uninstallation from the Windows side and the mess that causes. So I think this is a great way to do PHP development, and this is in fact how I do my PHP development on my Windows machine. So I think it's a great way to do things. If you found this video helpful, definitely go ahead and click that like button, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more like this, and be sure to check out the videos I posted previously. Again, I'll leave the link to the last WSL, PHP and WSL video in the description below, but definitely check out all of my previous videos where I talk both about conceptual things and process aspects of being a software developer, as well as various technical aspects. And I've got many more coming up in future weeks. Please be sure to share this, subscribe, and give it a like. And I hope you have a great week and great rest of your day, great week, great month, great year. Until I see you again, hopefully in the next video. But thank you so much for watching.